very effective for them. So tonight our guest is Dr. Noam Chomsky, really probably considered the greatest public intellectual alive, and very prolific author, over 100 books, almost as prolific as another author that I used to favor when I was younger, Isaac Asimov, who wrote over 500 books. But Isaac Asimov isn't quoted like Noam does. Noam Chomsky is one of the 8th most quoted authors in modern civilization, which is just astounding. So to write so much and have all that work held in very high regard is quantity and quality together is extremely exceptional. Dr. Noam Chomsky, how are you doing tonight?
Good to be with you.
It's great to have you here.
It's a great pleasure. It's a great pleasure. One of your recent talks, and an article came out of it, was you titled it, Can Civilization Survive Capitalism? At least that was the title of the article. And it was referring specifically to your discussion of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, writing up legislation that can be applied state by state to distort our educational system so students can't even understand basic science. So if you could perhaps talk a little bit about that again. That's so crucial for people to be aware of.
Well, this ALEC is American Legislative Exchange Council is a very well-funded corporate-based lobbying group, which primarily designs legislation for states, and it's got enough clout so that many of them are accepted. This is a pretty reactionary corporate funding, the Koch brothers and others. This particular program that you mentioned is an educational program. They want to introduce a program into the schools, K-12, for what they call balanced teaching of environmental science. Balanced teaching means alongside of the basic science that's backed by 99% of scientists, all national academies of science around the world, what appears in the science magazines and technical magazines. Alongside of that, you should teach climate change denial. And that'll give balanced teaching. Teach children critical thinking and so on. It's an obvious effort to try to induce skepticism about the extremely serious threat of environmental catastrophe, which might be not too remote. There's plenty of ongoing discoveries almost daily that indicate that it's more dire than was expected, and that the very few grounds for skepticism are being undermined case by case. The consensus on this is quite unusual for a complex scientific issue, which has been heavily studied. And this is a part of a much broader effort, corporate effort, which is openly announced, it's not a great secret, by the main lobbying groups, the American Chamber of Commerce, main business lobbies, Chamber of Commerce, the Petroleum Institute, and others, to try to prevent the American population from joining virtually the entire world in taking some serious steps towards addressing this disaster. Now, it's had a bit of, the campaign has had some effect on the public. The American public tends to be somewhat more skeptical than other comparable countries, but it's still much too close to the scientific, the public is much too close to the scientific consensus for the wishes of the corporate sector, the ones who want it denied. And that's the point of the ALEC program. Policy, incidentally, is far more divorced from the international consensus than attitudes are. So out of about 110 relevant countries, the United States is the only one that doesn't have a national program to deal with the impact of climate change, and that doesn't have national renewable energy targets. We're off the spectrum on that. The public wants them, but policy doesn't follow them. In fact, that's one of many examples in which policy is quite sharply divorced from public attitudes, and that conforms very closely to the demands of the corporate sector and the very wealthy. That's a rather very general feature of what I call in that paper that you quoted, really existing democracy, which is quite different from democracy.
Yes, I mean, there just is no democracy, really. And it does seem like, though, the democracy among the elites, you sort of have the right-wing side of the elite try to screw over the liberal elites. For example, the voter suppression that was sort of pushed through by Republican governors of certain southern states and so forth. So it seems like it's becoming less of a democracy even for the elites. Don't you think, in a way?
Well, there's actually very good research in professional political science about that. It's one of the main topics they study is public attitudes. And in the United States, you can study that pretty well. It's a very heavily polled society. A lot of the polls are quite serious and well done, so you get good, consistent results about what people want. And, of course, you can see policy, so therefore you can compare policy with attitudes. And the results are quite striking. Turns out roughly the case that for about 70% of the population, the lowest 70% on the wealth income scale, that 70% has effectively no effect on policy. What they believe just doesn't matter at all. Political figures don't pay any attention to them. The senators just don't listen, and so on. As you move up the scale, income and wealth, you get slowly a little more influence. And when you get to the very top, you get enormous influence. People essentially get what they want. It's not 100%, but it's a very striking tendency. So that what it means is that there's, in effect, there's a kind of plutocracy with most of the population essentially disenfranchised. And as you say, there are now efforts to try to extend that further, just as in the case of climate change denial. The skepticism, the American public is too close for comfort to the international scientific consensus, for the comfort of the corporate elements of the corporate structure, which don't want that. And exactly the same is true in the case of electoral democracy. It's too close to democratic, even though very far from it. And that's the point of these efforts to try to restrict and reduce voting by various techniques, voter ID, conditions, making it harder to vote, so no votes on Sundays, people have to take off a work day, and many other devices are being used to try to cut back the electorate, and of course not the whole electorate, but a very special part of it. It's primarily an attempt to reduce the voting of poorer and less privileged sectors, including minorities, crucially, because they tend to vote Democratic, and the Republican governors you mentioned want to cut that out. So all kinds of trickery are being used to cut back voting.
I want to ask a question from one of our a young friend, Justin, who does all these online videos and very far left and only 19 years old, a self-declared communist. But he had a question about the future. since neoliberalism is having such a paralyzing effect on broad sectors of the working class, and by I assume he means wage pressure, benefits getting cut, social safety net, and so forth. Do you see the revolutionary left growing, or rather do you see a fascist far-right movement possibly growing in the future? You wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Well, there's no serious sign of a revolutionary left. There are many progressive forces of all kinds, but they're not revolutionary. They're trying to work within the existing system to overcome the kinds of very dangerous developments that you just mentioned. And that, in my opinion, makes sense. You can't have you can't expect people, it wouldn't make sense for them to try to participate in a revolutionary movement unless they were convinced that the limits of change, of reform, had been reached within existing institutions. So it makes perfect sense to press existing institutions to the limits to achieve what you can, and I think every revolutionary ought to be in favor of this and encourage the understanding that, yes, we can achieve a good deal, and we ought to. It's for the benefit of people to do it. But there will come points where you just can't go any further. At that point, you have to have institutional change. Now, and in fact, it's not a matter of sort of before and after. You can actually create elements of a future society within the existing one. And it's being done, in fact. It's not pie in the sky. So, for example, there are, particularly in northern Illinois, working class in the former industrial areas of working Ohio, and also other places, there's an interesting growth of worker-owned enterprises. They've extended quite significantly. And that's, these are elements of a future, free society, a true democratic society, communist society, if you want to call it that, anarchist society.
But I guess the concern is on the growing far right. I mean, for example, I think, was it the Southern Law Center, or something like that, put out an alert that we now have over 1,000 right-wing militias. So I mean, could a possible fascist movement grow out of that? And so that can always be there too. We've seen some politicians that bordered on such behavior. Alan West talked like a fascist, as far as I'm concerned, literally.
Well, it's always a danger everywhere. It's a danger in Europe. It's always been a danger here. These are forces that always exist in our kind of society, state capitalist societies like these, and they're a potential danger. Not very long ago, they were a very serious danger to the world in Europe, and they've existed in many other countries since. Right now in Europe, for example, neo-fascist parties are coming close to power, sometimes in dominant positions in Central and Eastern Europe, for example. It's not trivial. And there are elements of that here. In fact, even some very mainstream scholars have written even in journals like Foreign Affairs, the major establishment journal. There, for example, a couple of years ago was an article by one of the leading specialists on Germany in the country, Fritz Stern, describing what he called descent into barbarism. And he was writing about the collapse of civilization and the descent into barbarism very rapidly in Germany in the 30s, but he was clearly pointing to analogies in the United States.
Do you think we're descending into barbarism now, in that sense?
Well, I hope not, and we can certainly prevent it, but there's a danger. I mean, take just the thing that we began with, the efforts to try to undermine actions and to confront the potential crisis of environmental catastrophe. That'll be worse than fascism. I mean, that could be an end to the prospects for decent survival. And we might not be too far away. If you take a look at the mounting scientific evidence, it increasingly indicates that there might be a tipping point, in the lifetime of our children and grandchildren. In fact, one recent study that just came out in the journal Science, the main American scientific journal, the study of Arctic Siberian ice cores going back 500 years, and it's a study of how the melting was affected by temperature changes, and the conclusion is pretty alarming. The conclusion, if has to be further verified, but the conclusion of this study is that even the kind of warming that's anticipated could be sufficient to melt the permafrost, which will release huge amounts of methane into the atmosphere that's far more destructive than carbon dioxide, and that could set off processes which would sharply escalate the severe harm from global warming.
Yeah, most people don't seem to realize that it's like ice and water. As the ice is melting, the temperature is not going up. You have this phase transition. They call it the thermal heat of fusion. Measures basically gives you the temperature which stays steady during that period of time. Once the ice is gone, that heat energy goes into increasing temperature. So there'll be an amazing temperature increase once all that ice is gone. That's not talked about. It's basic physics. That's in a high school physics book. It's not even talked about on the news.
No.
There was pretty serious reporting discoveries at the end of the summer when the Arctic ice melting period ended, and studies were taken about how far it went. Turned out it was far beyond what had been predicted, and it has the kind of consequences you described. As the Arctic ice melts, there's less reflective surface. There's more, black water, less white ice, and it absorbs more sunlight, less reflection. That speeds up the warming, and you get a nonlinear. It's called a nonlinear effect. It keeps growing faster and faster, rapidly.
Well, so because of the concentration of gas, it would be nonlinear. The only time, for example, that extreme weather was talked about in relation to global warming, even though a number of scientists were already recognizing and publishing about this, was during Hurricane Sandy. When a hurricane threatens New York City, the financial network, I guess then, the financial nerve center of the country, and then there's some grumbling that maybe this bad weather is connected to global warming. Did it seem obvious to you?
Well, the climate models, all of them predict more extreme variation in weather as you have global warming. But science hasn't reached the point where you can say that this particular event was the result of global warming. The probability of it increased.
It increased dramatically.
It doesn't tell you whether that particular hurricane was. It's just more likely that you'll get
would have more
things.
kinetic energy.
Yeah, but it's a sign of, it's a danger sign. It's kind of like the canary in the coal mines. It's ludicrous to ignore it. And most of the world isn't ignoring it. And in fact, even the American population isn't ignoring it, though policy is ignoring it. In fact, policy is going in the opposite direction. It's discussed that a little bit in that article. There's a kind of a remarkable phenomenon taking place throughout the world right now. This problem is a very severe one, and there are various reactions to it. In the forefront of trying to do something serious to mitigate or end the catastrophe, in the forefront are indigenous populations, tribal societies, traditional societies. So, for example, in Ecuador, where there's a large indigenous population that's been able to influence policy, they are trying to gain support for, they're an oil producer, they're trying to gain support for keeping their oil in the ground where it ought to be. When you get to the richest and most advanced societies like ours and Canada's with incomparable advantages, we're doing the opposite. We're trying to accelerate the race to disaster. So while they're trying to keep the oil in the ground where it ought to be, we're trying hard to get every last drop of even very dangerous hydrocarbons like tar sands out of the ground as fast as possible. And both political parties are, hell-bent, proud of the goal of it, trying to achieve the goal of what they call a century of energy independence, which means getting everything out that we can, making things as dangerous as possible. It's I mean, if there's ever a historian in the future, there may not be. And looking back at this, they'd be just appalled.
Yeah, it's very scary. So basically, colonial settler nations are the worst in behavior, the ones not primarily populated and run by their indigenous population. Would you say that's primarily class-driven issue then? It's a class structure issue of those societies?
To a very large extent. I mean, the United States and Canada is rather like it, is a highly stratified society. It's to an unusual extent in the world. It's a business-run society with a very class-conscious business class. That's one of the reasons why inequality is so much higher here than in other societies. It's why the United States is virtually alone in the world in not having a functioning national health system, a highly dysfunctional, mostly privatized system, very costly, a lot of deaths and so on, and many other respects, very low benefits by comparative standards. All of these are, huge attacks on the labor movement, a very violent labor history. These are all reflections of the fact that it's, for all kind of historical reasons, to an unusual extent, a business-run society. There have been powerful popular democratic movements, and they've achieved quite a lot. In fact, in some respects, the United States is a world leader. So takes a freedom of speech, which is a very significant right, very important. I mean, that's protected in the United States probably more than any major country in the world. Now, it's not in the Bill of Rights. I mean, that's, there's words there, but the protections really came much more recently. They're a mid-20th century phenomenon. In fact, the biggest step forward was in the context of the civil rights movement. And quite commonly, rights are won by popular struggle. They're not gifts from above. And the same can be true of what we were talking about before, the potential environmental catastrophe, or maybe a real one not very far away. It's going to take substantial popular activism and education to overcome concentrated power that wants to accelerate the danger. I should say it's not the individuals. So the same people who may be, funding efforts to turn the country into sort of a stupid nation which doesn't understand, those same people individually may be, contributing to the Sierra Club. They understand what's happening as well as the rest of us do. But they have a kind of an institutional role in their capacities as, say, CEO of a corporation. The institutional structure compels them to act differently. It's back to your radical friend who you quoted before. This is a serious institutional problem, which is driving the society towards possible disaster. So it's kind of inherent in market societies. I mean, we don't have really a market society, but to the extent that there is a market, the well-known deficiencies of markets, and they are well-known, enter. Like one crucial market inefficiency, you can read about it in every economics text, is that transactions do not take into account what are called externalities, the effects on others. So, for example, if you sell me a car, we may make a good deal for ourselves, but we don't pay attention to the costs that it imposes on the guy next door. And it does impose a cost. There's more pollution, more traffic accidents, price of gas goes up, and so on. Well, these externalities can be huge. And one of them, the most vast of all, is environmental catastrophe. So when a business is making decisions, it is not taking it, it's not internalizing the cost of perhaps destruction of the environment. That's just not considered. And it won't be considered in a market system. That's part of the fundamental and possibly even lethal defects of these systems.
A very defective capitalism itself.
It's a fundamental
and the public's just not made aware of it at all. The issues that are covered and take up a huge chunk of the news seem to, well, for example, the gun control debate. Valid public safety issue, perhaps, but it doesn't put more food on one's table and certainly doesn't prevent potential disaster to the human race. But it's an issue that's promoted at times almost half the news cycle, and it's extremely polarizing. I've never seen people so split up over it, yelling at each other across the hall, in a sense.
It's a serious issue, and it ought to be dealt with, but you're perfectly right. It's not of anywhere near the scale of, say, climate disaster, the threat of nuclear war, and others.
I mean, do you think it's deliberate in the sense that it takes so much of the news cycle, and it's also deliberately polarizing? It's an amazingly distracting issue. It certainly takes people's minds off key issues.
I think it's more indirect. I mean, the media have a concept of objectivity, which they are proud of. They explain it, and they try to keep to it. Objectivity means recounting accurately what's happening inside the Beltway, within Washington circles, within decision-making circles. So if the Democrats and the Republicans are arguing about something, you're supposed to discuss that. If they're not, if they're basically agreeing on something, you don't discuss it. And one of the things they're basically agreeing on is subordination to corporate power and disregard of massive externalities like destruction of the environment. So therefore you're down to what they're willing to debate, which is not insignificant, like guns are an important issue, but I don't think it's deliberate deception. It's another kind of almost institutional property, serious. These properties are very fundamental. They're not bad. It's not a matter of bad people. It's a matter of institutions structured so as to maximize bad choices. That's a serious problem.
Yeah. Well, and also if you're a reporter for the Beltway, you want to keep in line because if you go out of it, you lose access, and that's how you're punished. You just lose access.
More than that. I mean, ask yourself. Take a look at any congressional representative somewhere. Suppose that he or she leaves Congress and goes back to private life. What are they going to be? Is the person going back to be a truck driver, a data processor, a secretary, a nurse? No, the person is going to go back to a cushy job in a lobbying firm, probably lobbying for the area that the person was legislating in, a management position, and so on. And those are the rewards for behaving properly while you're in your legislative role. Quite apart from the fact that elections are by now. I mean, we're so remote from a functioning democracy, that elections are substantially bought, which means you're in debt to the plebeian for you.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Chomsky, I mean, it is 11:30, so ahead of time based on what. But would you be willing to entertain some guest questions? I mean, audience questions.
Yeah, but I really can't stay long. I've got another one coming up. Yeah.
No, whenever you want to call.
Sure, couple more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, well,
Sure.
we have if somebody is here on Skype, I believe. As soon as I can get them in. Hello, you're on the air. Hello. Okay, then.
Didn't work. Listen, I'm afraid I'll really have to take off. I've got another call coming in a minute. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
So,
Dr. Chomsky,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Please come again.
Okay, good to talk to you. Yep, bye.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Good night.